Hello, I'm Karen Long, President and founder of Streamline Government Contracts. Streamline helps small to mid-sized government contractors who seek experienced, effective support with contract management that will help reduce risks, increase profits, and enhance your reputation. We do this by negotiating teaming agreements, subcontracts, preparing estimates at completion, and communicating with the contracting officer in their own language. We are the proud sponsors of Government Contractor Chat. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone. I am Lindsay Riegelsberger, Operations Manager and Marketing Specialist for Streamline Government Contracts. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker now. Toby Musser, founder and CEO of M&S Group, has over 25 years of experience as a business leader in technology and security with in-depth experience implementing the vision, practice management, process, and compliance for medium and small businesses. M&S Group is an MSP managed service provider and MSSP managed security service provider that specializes in security and compliance services and IT implementation for government contractors. M&S Group is a CMMC registered provider organization and authorized CMMC 3CPAO third-party assessment organization, as well as providing ISO, CIS, CMMI audits, assessments, readiness, and preparation practices. Toby operates his business and resides in Hartford County, Maryland, where he lives with his wife and business partner, Laura, and their family. Without further ado, Toby Musser.
So much for that kind introduction. Please feel free during the presentation at any time to jump in and ask a question or for any points of clarification. I especially happy to see Brian here. Good to hear your voice, and thanks for coming along. Feel free to jump in if I missed something. All right, so the cybersecurity maturity model and certification, what it is and why it matters. Here's an agenda that we prepared today as we talk through this. I'm not going to read the slide to you, right? But this is where we're going. From story to data to timelines, and then questions and answers at the end. If you haven't thought of them during the middle, we of course have Matt Ventura with us, who's on the path once he has three rounds of assessments under his belt of being a CCA or an auditor. So we're excited to have him here to provide some in-depth answers where it's appropriate. Okay, so M&S Group, so we're staffed with certified individuals in CMMC. We currently are supporting a little under 300 locations on 6 continents. These dots are not completely accurate, but they're representative of where we're doing support. And we're very proud of that. We've been around since 1999. And since 2016, we've been focused on government contractors, the federal contracting space, and people who need to comply with federal acquisition regulations, and especially focused on the Defense Department. All right, why should you listen to us? Why should you listen to me? Well, we have some experience to bring to bear and some expertise. Currently, 20% of the C3POs that use Google's FedRAMP High environment that's an environment that M&S Group maintains and helps deploy. It's sold by Cysiv, one of our teaming partners who helped develop it, and we support that environment. So we're one of the few people who can help both in Google and the Microsoft world, and we have experience going through our various assessors. We now have 7 surveillances that have been completed by people who are W-2 employees, as well as contractors of M&S Group. So we have real world experience and have already gone through some of the joint surveillance with DIBCAC, the government's assessment or audit arm, if you want to use normal English. All right, so some of this is probably review for some of you, but let's just understand the warrant, the reason we have for CMMC and the need for this focus on an audit and assessment practice to ensure that people are successful in keeping their contractual obligations and securing information. This is just one slide of many that you could find. We took this from the GAO, but I'm sure you can find other ones. It's a big problem. It has a big financial consequence, maintaining security of information. And there's a lot of dollars listed here. I want to take a moment, though, as we think about dollars and give you a different thing to consider. Imagine that one of the enemies of our country or our allies is able to get into somebody's network. And the normal story we hear is, oh no, they stole how to make body armor. And now our enemies have great body armor. That's sort of a normal story you would hear, some sort of example like that. But this is a much more serious thing than just losing money or somebody stealing a design. Our enemies are then trying to modify the design elements in schematics and drawings or in mixes to degrade our own capabilities to complete the task at hand. So what I just said in English is they might steal the design for the ceramic plates and body armor and then edit the designs on the contractor's manufacturing equipment to use the wrong mix of materials so that when our warfighters in the field and a bullet hits them, that body armor fails and doesn't protect them. And this undermines our fighting forces' confidence in their equipment, and that undermines their ability to perform in the field to defend our country and our freedoms. So this is not just a money problem. It's not just an information problem. We're talking about people's lives being at risk because this information not only can leak out, but can be modified by the enemy. So keep that in mind. We're talking about real people in the field defending our freedoms. Right, so it's not good, right? You can see this chart. You can see that the government has a lot of vulnerabilities. Part of this problem is the nature of government's very, I'll say it in the most proper way, government's very measured pace in deploying new technology and new innovations, right? There's a process to ensure the government doesn't get taken advantage of. And those same processes also make it very slow for things to be updated or changed to ensure that all of the requirements and various regulations are met and that people who are involved or responsible are all respected for their various areas. We call this bureaucracy. It does have a great benefit, but in cybersecurity, it's a bit of a curse because the government can't move as quickly as the commercial space. You know, cyber criminals are very creative and very active. I just gave you one example of body armor being degraded. And there's such creativity here. Certainly we have these capabilities and try to use them against our enemies. They're using them against us. To give you an idea of sort of the out-of-band approaches to hacking, I'll draw your attention to, you know, a fish tank thermometer. This is one of my favorite stories in terms of why we need to pay attention. If somebody can get into a thermometer that's on your Wi-Fi through a Bluetooth security error and then scan your network and take your information, and you never even knew that it was happening, you just wanted to know that your fish weren't going to die in your front office that you have, so when everybody waits, they feel nice. You can read the other ones here. This is like USB keys found in parking lots or left in the back seat of a cab or an Uber. All sorts of different things that are either just human error or not thinking about the implications of a choice to deploy something. Electronic thermostats, cameras on your doors that are commercial, but not designed for government contractors that have chipsets that loop through servers in other countries. These are all the types of things that the criminals are using. All right, so this is why we're here today. What is CMMC? So the CMMC is a standard to validate that contractors are doing the things that are in their contracts. There was some confusion because the first version of CMMC added additional things for you to do. The current version does not. They took that stuff out. All it is doing is an audit, or an assessment is the proper language, but I'm trying to, be sensitive to people who might not be in the government space. We're just evaluating under CMMC that you are doing the things that you've committed to do under your existing contracts. And these things that we're checking for have been in contracts since 2017, so they're not new. And this is to help people actually do the things they need to do in the correct fashion. So it's built upon several regulations here, as I've listed on the slide. So if there's one thing you're going to remember from this, the primary source of truth is the DoD CIO's website. There's a lot of out-of-date information or just plain bad information on the internet. And so even when you hear somebody like me who's working in this field, you always want to go validate the statements and the claims that they make against the DoD CIO. I put the URL here on this slide, and certainly when this is distributed later, you can look at that. But you want to go right to the source, the DoD CIO, and that's where you'll find the documents that I have to use and our team has to use as we assess you, as well as the regulations and news about how this rule is being applied. So always go to the source of truth and validate the information that you hear in the marketplace or when you see proposals from various service providers. All right, who is impacted? Well, in various ways, it's over 300,000 businesses. We don't know the exact number is the truth, however, because there's not a reporting mechanism when a prime has a sub and then the sub has a sub and the sub has a sub and so on and so forth. We just know there are a lot, right? So 300,000 is one estimate, but it is a guess. Anybody has a DoD contract, any subcontractors under a DoD prime, and there's greater impacts. This is aimed at the DoD. We'll talk about federal contracts in a couple minutes, but this is primarily aimed at DoD contractors, though it will expand later. There are some exceptions for commercial off-the-shelf products. So think of like Adobe Acrobat. It's a piece of software you just buy and you pay for it, right? That's commercial off-the-shelf. No customization. It's just a thing that does a specific task for you. So there's some exceptions for those types of products. All right, now we're going to spend probably 15 minutes going through some definitions. If you have coffee, now it's the time to take a big swig if you're not into acronyms. So let's define a couple things that I'll be talking about in a little more depth. So the FAR, you'll hear me mention the FAR, that's Federal Acquisition Regulations. And so this has every rule around how to buy stuff or to sell stuff to the federal government. There's a subset of the FAR, DFARS. So that is geared towards the Department of Defense. Now the FAR is supposed to have a section doing what CMMC is doing underneath the DoD. We'll talk about that later. That's FAR 40. But today we're mainly focusing on CMMC. All right, CUI, sometimes people will say CUI, is controlled unclassified information. I'm just giving you a few examples. This is not an exhaustive list. There is a list the government provides at archives.gov, and you can go look at all the things that are CUI. I want to let you know that everything in that list may not apply to you. You have to look when something is described as CUI at archives.gov. It may be under a special circumstance. So just because you see it listed doesn't mean it applies to you. You actually need to take the time to read the description and go all the way to the bottom and you'll see some notes about how it applies. FCI is contract information. And the list on the screen is not an exhaustive list. Think about any type of information related to the nature of the contract. Now, I've had some people ask, why in the world do we care about protecting this? And it comes from a principle where non-sensitive information, if enough of it is put together, it can become sensitive information. A silly example might be, say you're a hot dog vendor and you sell hot dogs to the base down the road. And every month you sell 1,000 hot dogs. All of a sudden, you get an order for 10,000 hot dogs. This is great. Your business is expanded. You're making money. Life is good. And if the enemies of our country know that you're now shipping 10,000 hot dogs to that base, they can infer that there's a lot more troops at that base, or that that base is preparing for some big activity. And so something as simple as selling hot dogs to a base actually can be used for our enemies to discern what our plans are to defend our freedoms. All right, you'll hear about SPRS. This has been out for a while. I have a little screen capture so you can make sure you go to the right website. If you are a contractor, you should have already seen this website, or your compliance team should have already seen this website. This is where you go put your risk as a supplier in so that contract officers can validate to ensure that you're following your contractual obligations. So every single person who has a contract or a subcontract should have a score already in the system. If you don't, you need to call us or someone like us right away, because you are out of compliance with your contract. And as we'll talk about a little later, there are now some teeth to CMMC. All right, let's talk about the Christian doctrine. What does religion have to do with it? Well, it's not about religion at all. It's just a gentleman whose surname was Christian. But this is something that's really important for you to understand as you deal with contracts, or if you deal with businesses that you assist who have contracts. Let me summarize it this way for you. I'm going to list for you some deforest clauses. You may go back to your contract and go, I don't have those clauses. I don't need to worry about it. Well, it's different when you're doing business with the federal government. In the commercial world, if a contract is missing a clause, you don't have to comply with it. But with the federal government, under the Christian doctrine, if the contract officer forgets to put it in, or even if they intentionally omit one of these clauses, you are still required to do them, even if they are not in your contract. All right, so we're going to go through history here. Let's start back in 2016. This is sort of the beginning of CMMC for practical purposes. We could trace it back, a couple decades, but in 2016, here's where you first had the requirement entered, and it came into force really in 2017 to protect this sensitive information, to document your security parameters, to keep track of any improvements you need to do compliance, and to understand where that information is going with your subcontractors, to report any incidents or breaches, and to also submit malicious software for an analytical review if something happens within your organization. So this clause, when it was added, many people did not take the financial impact of this clause into account when they were bidding on the contracts. And so it's been an issue because people say, I don't have the money to do it, because since the beginning, they haven't been including it, but now it's required. So that's where we started, 2016. All right, then we have DFAR 7019, this is in 2020. This is saying, hey, you have to put this score in. Remember I mentioned SPRS in the website earlier? And this is requiring you to keep track of that score. How are you doing in complying with your contract? And then we move to DFAR 7020, that's in 2020. It starts to say, hey, you have to have this clause in the contract. So even though we have the Christian doctrine, to stop confusion, there's just a very clear directive to have these clauses in the contracts for all the contract officers. Most contract officers aren't aware of all of the regulations. It's just too much to keep track of. And so sometimes they have to be prescriptive and say, hey, all of you, you must include this one. All right, now we have 7021, that came out in 2020. But I want you to notice on acquisition.gov, the latest effective date here is June 9th, this month, this year. All right, so these are active, and you should pay attention. If you hear people saying nothing's happening, this has been a very active month. I'll show you some other screen captures. These rules are marching along for the government, a rapid pace. We really expect to hear something out in the next few months. And I would put out there my prognostication, M&S Group's guess is that it's going to be closer to May or June of next year when it finalizes than the end of next year. The official word is really that it will be done by the end of next year. I think it's going to be sooner than that. All right, new requirements. Maybe you aren't aware of this. Is June 9th, this month, 7024. A number of new requirements. I think one of the important subparts of this is this idea that the contracting officer shall, it's the language is shall, they have to consider your SPRS score as part of their grading of your proposal. All right, I mentioned the FAR, right? Federal acquisition requirements or regulations. So you'll see here 614. So that's a couple days in the past. This is active right now. The purpose of this is to take the concept of CMMC, and some people think maybe the CMMC rule itself will just be copied here in some form, but the concept of CMMC is going to come to every single federal contract in existence. So it's not just the Department of Defense. It's going to be all federal contracts. All right, a little bit of history. I mentioned it earlier. This is where a lot of angst and confusion happened with CMMC. Under the first model with 5 different levels, they actually incorporated additional maturity practices above and beyond something called NIST 800-171. That's the standard which CMMC is validating and is based upon. And this, of course, when it went to the SBA for review and people looked at it, added a lot of additional expense for contractors, and there was a lack of clarity for implementation. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's the gist. So they came back and said, all right, you know what? The regulation is published, references 800-171, and Model 2, that's what we're under now, is validating NIST 800-171. There's 2 levels, and we'll talk about that a little more in a moment. The vast majority of companies they originally estimated would fall only under level 1. As time goes on, though, that number continues to shift. It is not an exact number, and more people are just complying with level 2 because of the lack of clarity with the government. All right, level 1, this is foundational. These are basic things. This is something that you're probably already doing if you run a business and you have an MSP or an IT person. Not 100%, but probably. These are really, really basic things. Antivirus software, changing passwords, keeping track of your contract information, making sure your QuickBooks is not out there on the internet, those types of things. Level 2, this is one that's a little heavier lift and requires an assessment to validate it. So these include policies, procedures, and practices that they're documented, managed, supported, and that there's evidence. Now, you'll hear a different term for evidence. You'll hear the term artifacts, right? If you hear artifacts in normal English, that would just be evidence that you're doing all of these practices. There's actually 110 practices, 320 things, sub-bullet points, if you were under it, that you have to do as part of NIST 800-171. There's a free guide on the website that I mentioned earlier. That's the DoD-CIO's website, and it's the level 2 assessment guide. It's actually for me and my team, but it's written in great English and it gives you examples. If you download the assessment guide, 1, you'll know what a company like mine's going to ask you when we come in to do your assessment. You'll have some examples of what types of objectives or evidence artifacts that we might ask for. We could ask to observe somebody doing something. We could want to see a log file. We might want to review a policy, piece of policy paperwork, and that you're following that policy. But that level 2 assessment guide, if you spent 320 seconds a day, that's 5 minutes and 20 seconds. But the 320 seconds, if you read that every day in 1 month, you read the whole assessment guide, you wouldn't be an expert, but you have a really good feel of what you need to do in your organization. And I think you'd be well served by that. This is maybe tedious, but it's not as difficult as many people fear it is. So I highly encourage you to spend that 320 seconds a day to learn those 320 things that that'll help. And Matt, thank you. He's put the link there in the chat for everybody. All right, so why are we doing this? We're trying to defend our country. We're trying to defend freedom for you and I, for our children, for our grandchildren. We're trying to preserve the lives of our warfighters out there in the field that are defending your freedom with their blood, sweat, and tears. It's really, really important. This has a human cost, as I mentioned earlier. This is not just a business problem. So we're lowering threats. We're trying to I think the way it was said to Congress is the defense industrial base is the soft underbelly of the United States. And we're trying to put some armor around it. All right. You saw this slide already, but I'm going to talk about it one more time. Who's impacted? Everybody who's a defense contractor. And as you saw, it seems that they're rapidly moving to expand this to all federal contractors. So defense contractors right now, federal contractors coming soon. All right, here's sort of the timeline. I have laid it out for you, but there's a drop dead of October 2025. There's 320 things to do. If companies aren't in fact doing those things, it's going to take you some time to do them. 12 to 18 months is the guess. But you should start now. But wait, there's more. All right, we had the interim rule. You should be doing this. This is uploading the SBR score. Remember, I showed you that website earlier. If you haven't, you should have your score there, your system security plan, and any plans of action or POAMs and milestones to resolve any security shortfalls that you have. How much is this going to cost? We don't know. We already have seen some very small C3POs that are like 1 or 2 man shops do joint assessments with DIBCAC and charge in the $35,000 to $45,000 range. We've seen larger assessments with multiple locations ranging in the $75,000 to $95,000 range. We've seen a couple big primes and assessments of large organizations like Microsoft be hundreds of thousands of dollars. So some of the cost is related to how many locations you have, but the general cost we suspect is going to end up in that $60,000 to $100,000 range for a single location. It's really hard to estimate. The reason for that is there's some details in the final rule that's about to be published that affect how much it costs for me to do an assessment. And so I need to understand those costs so that I can properly adjust my price to take those into account. So that's where the variable is in price. Getting a gap assessment, 12,000 to 40,000 is kind of a range we see out there. I think the 40,000 for a single location, it's hard to say if that's fair or not, right? If you have a lot of physical controls that are necessary and on-site time, it can be higher. If it's a gap assessment that can be done remotely and you have great documentation, it can be a lot lower. But these are the ranges. I've talked to a number of financing companies, I've talked to banks and leasing companies, and they're all excited, as you might imagine, to help you spread this cost over the 3-year time period. So for a smaller company who might not be able to write this check, they could use financial tools like a lease or a loan and pay it over the 3-year period. It's important to remind people of that. All right, the marketplace. There's a link down here at the bottom. And this is where you go find people who have actually passed their certifications and companies that are authorized to do the work. One thing that I will clarify for you is that a C3PO like ourselves cannot do your gap analysis and give you advice and then also do your assessment, right? That would be a conflict. So if you choose a C3PO, you'll have to probably have two if you want a C3PO to do your gap assessment. It might be possible to do both, but it's not worth the risk of violating the ethics rules. So we wouldn't do that. All right, start now, right? Review your contracts. I won't read all the bullet points to you, right? There's time, and you can do this. And you should start right now. All right, we mentioned this already. I'm mentioning it again. You should already have your SPRS score uploaded, and if you're a consultant for a contractor, you should make sure that they've done this. Why it matters to you? Here we're almost done. CMMC has teeth. Did you know that if you don't have your certificate, you cannot receive new contract awards or extensions once the rule finalizes? Did you know that you won't get paid on current contracts without a certification? I've heard a number of people say, hey, I have contracts that are good for 3 years. I don't have to bother about this. They don't renew. No, that's not the way it's going to work. Also, the executive who signs the documents is personally and legally responsible. So whoever it is in the contractor's compliance office that signs off that things are done, if they are lying, or even if they're misinformed, even if it's unintentional, this is just like commercial liability insurance, right? If you bought insurance for your house and the insurance questionnaire said, do you have sprinklers? And you had sprinklers on one floor of the house, but not all the floors, but you answered yes everywhere to the best of your knowledge, and you have a fire, the insurance company is going to cover your claim because you did it to the best of your knowledge. But if you were in a business and you said you had sprinklers and there weren't sprinklers everywhere, you were making legal attestation. The insurance company will say, no, I won't pay for your fire damage because it's not to the best of your knowledge. It's a legal attestation. Same thing here. The executive who signs the paperwork is personally and legally responsible. All right, we went through a lot of stuff there, and I think we hit the time. Said 12:45. I think we nailed it, Karen. Any questions? We'd love to chat or be helpful if we can.
All right. So I'll start off, and I have a few questions that I was wondering about. If a company has a service provider, do they need to get a clearance?
So let me reflect the question back and make sure I heard it correctly. So
Okay.
a contractor has its own clearance. It's doing some sort of cleared work in a cleared facility, and they're doing work. And your question is, if they have like an MSP or an IT person, does that person or company need a clearance? Is that
Correct.
what you're asking?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, so the answer is maybe. Unfortunately, I can't give you an exact answer. So as long as that contractor has no way to access that sensitive information, and there's policies, procedures, and practices in place to prevent that, you can use somebody who doesn't have a clearance. You would have to, you could also use somebody if you follow all the normal rules. So imagine they come to your facility. You would need to have your FSO or somebody. You'd have to escort them just the way you would normally escort somebody. People would have to clear their desks. Here at our office, we have a big light that starts flashing if there's a guest on the floor so that everybody knows they clear their desk and that sensitive information should not be out. There's a term you may or may not be familiar with, this idea of spillage. It's the accidental revelation of sensitive information, might be secret or otherwise. You would have to declare an incident if somebody like that had access to that information to deal with that spillage.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And then the other question that came to mind was, are there regulations that apply to an MSP or an IT provider that I should know before, selecting them to help with a task or delivering contract requirements?
Sure, that's a great question. A way to answer it would be this. Anybody that you do business with as a contractor or subcontractor that uses technology with you, you should have a shared responsibility matrix. A spreadsheet is the simplest way that goes through the requirements and simply says, this is my technology provider's responsibility. This is my responsibility, or it's a shared responsibility. And you need to document who is responsible for those areas of compliance. And not only document that, but make sure that you ask for the artifacts or evidence, right? The artifacts, so that you have them and you could demonstrate to an assessor like myself or DIBCAC if the government came in, that they are doing the things that they say they are doing. So a shared responsibility matrix should be in place. If you're vetting somebody, if you're hiring them and you get the shared responsibility matrix and there's something they do and then you don't do it, or there's something they don't do and you don't do, you need to address that before signing the contract, because you don't want to commit to a 1 or 2 year contract, for instance, with a managed service provider who's unable to meet some of the requirements.
And so, Toby, so should government contractors be, selecting a CMMC assessor now, or what is the timeline that you recommend?
Well, I'm a little biased, so understand that. I think you should be selecting a authorized C3PO now and trying to arrange your spot in line. That's what we're doing. We don't know when the rule will finalize, but we're allowing people to commit to a spot in line so that when the big rush happens, they can be sure that they've completed their assessment in a timely fashion to maintain their contracts. Right now, there's less than 50, last time I checked. A few more come every day, which is great, authorized C3PAOs. And the best information we have, maybe by then next year, there'll be 200 in a perfect world. Somewhere between, let's say in the low end, 40,000, high end, 80,000 plus contractors will need to go through this process in the next 24 months. And if you just do that simple math and divide it by the authorized C3PAOs, it's going to be difficult to get a spot in line in time. So we're all working together to try to get more people on the team. There's more than enough work for all the authorized C3PAOs. And so, I would definitely say try to have those conversations now, get some quotes, understand costs, commitments, timelines, and line that up for the success of your business. Many contractors envision selling their business sometimes when they win. Having this lined up is something that really drives the value of your business. There's also a question here. Sam, you asked, has anything been announced for third levels for CMMC? Sort of. So NIST 800-172 is the next step up, right? And some things from 172 are going to be part of level 3. So you'll do 171 plus some of the things in 172. Here's how the process will work. You'll do all the things in 171 and the things in 172 that are announced. You'll have to hire a C3PO like us. We'll come do an assessment. You'll get that for your 171. Then the government, DIBCAC, will come in and do the assessment at the level 3. So it's a two-step process. Now, everything I just said there, this is my current understanding. We don't have the final rule yet, but it's really close. So I feel like I'm giving you a pretty solid explanation.
So questions going once, going twice, and I will hand it back to Lindsay.
Thank you, Toby and Karen. We also want to thank you for joining us today, and we'd like to invite you to join us for our next webinar, The 5 Ways Small GovCon Strategize, presented by Shirley Collier, President of Scale to Market and host of Growth Masters Federal Podcast. You can scan the QR code on the screen now to register for this event and see our events page as upcoming guest speakers are added. Thank you for being with us today. We hope to see you next time. To reach Toby and the M&S Group team, visit their website at www.mnsgroup.com, email them at sales@mnsgroup.com, or contact them via phone at 410-838-1088.